Hi, welcome back to our study in Genesis. We are in chapter 31. We left off the story where Jacob had now become a wealthy man. And we know that by the words at the end of chapter 30, where we see not only has Jacob increased his flocks through his selective breeding process, but it tells us he also has camels and servants. Those were indicators of great wealth, that his flocks had grown to the size where he could have traded and received those other uh, parts of his wealth as well. So at the beginning of chapter 31, we see that the tension is increasing between Laban and Laban's sons and Jacob and his group. These two groups are beginning to rival, and there is fear among Laban's household of Jacob's prosperity. And Jacob is beginning to fear of what they might do in retaliation to that. We also see that the Lord intervenes and appears to Jacob and tells him to head back home and gives him the assurance that I will be with you, God tells him. So Jacob begins to make plans to do that. It doesn't take much convincing at all with Leah and Rachel to get them on board. They're dissatisfied as well. They see how foolish their father has been, and they are with him. So Jacob looks for an opportune time to leave, and he waits until the text tells us that Laban and his men, his workers, are out away from the home place in the season of shearing the sheep and doing this work. So it gives Jacob an opportunity to flee, and that's exactly what he does. He takes all of his possessions and he gets about a 3-day head start. The text tells us. It takes a while for Laban to catch up with them, but he eventually does. Now we have a subplot that's going on in the story as well, is that the writer Moses tells us that Rachel also stole from her father their household idols, which tells us a little bit of something about Laban's people group, and that they are not worshipers of the one true God as Jacob is, that's been handed to him from his father and his grandfather Abraham. These household idols obviously were small, and Rachel could hide them, as we'll see later in the story. But they would have also been valuable. They would have probably been made out of precious metal. They would have been family heirlooms, and Rachel and Leah had complained about that Laban had not left them an inheritance, and maybe she's stealing these as a way of having some sort of inheritance. We also see in her, again, a lack of discretion and understanding in taking these household idols. It tells us very clearly, though, that Jacob has no knowledge that this is going on. But this is a nice little subplot that's going on. It's interesting. Jacob, it says he steals away and leaves, and Rachel also steals these household idols. Eventually, Laban catches up and overtakes Jacob's caravan, and he's upset. He's angry that he's been deceived and that Jacob has fled, and he tries to take this high road, acting all hurt, and you've taken my grandchildren and my daughters from me. How could you do this? If you had just said you were going to go, that you needed to go home, we could have thrown a big party for you and done it the right way, but nobody's buying this. Laban is just trying to lay guilt upon them and take this high road, but nobody really believes anything that he's saying. He also accuses, Jacob says, you've also stolen my household idols. And at this point, Jacob becomes very defensive. He becomes angry because he believes everything that he has done has been with integrity. He hasn't stolen anything from Laban, but he doesn't know that Rachel's done that. So Laban has this search all throughout Jacob's camp for these household idols. He eventually searches everywhere, even his daughter's tents, and he comes to Rachel. And one of the ironies of this story is not only has Jacob tricked Laban over the years, but now his own daughter Rachel tricks him, and she uses her leverage as a woman to trick him to say, I can't get up off of this saddle that I'm sitting on, which she had him hidden away in because it was her menstrual cycle, and he of course doesn't want to mess with that, so he believes her, and she tricks him. Now, after all of this is done, and it appears that, to Jacob's point of view, that he's been falsely accused, he's really angry, it says. And so he just unleashes on Laban and just recounts the 20 years of faithful service that he's given to Laban, that he has never stole from him or done anything that lacked integrity, but that it's God who has blessed him, even though Laban at every turn, particularly in those 6 years of working his flocks and that agreement, that Laban kept changing the conditions. We don't get exactly what he may have done during 6 years, but Jacob claims that he changed his wages 10 times. In other words, he changed the circumstances as God kept blessing Jacob. And it's important that we note how Jacob gives God the credit for that. In verses 41 and 42, here's what Jacob said. He said, "These 20 years I have been in your house. I have served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wage 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac," and when it says fear of Isaac, that's just another way of saying God, "had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night." Because indeed God had even appeared to Laban and said basically, I don't want you to aggress on Jacob. You leave him alone and you let him go. And so Laban was constrained to do that. So what ends up happening is Jacob and Laban enter into a covenant. And in this covenant, we see something very interesting in the story that we want to pay attention to, because it's really, I think, the main purpose of what we're supposed to see happening as the story is progressing. These 2 men enter into a covenant which ends up essentially being a no-harm covenant. We've seen this before. They set up some stones, a pile of stones as a marker of that place. But we see in what each man names that place the distinction between the 2 people groups. They both call the place heap of witness, but Laban uses an Aramaic word, and Jacob uses a Hebrew word. So we see already in the text back in verse 20 that Laban is called the Aramean, and we know that Jacob is going to be the father of the Hebrew people, the Israelites. So we're seeing 2 distinct people groups that are now separating for good. And they have this covenant of no harm, and they agree that neither one of them will pass over those stones to go and aggress against the other. So now we have, after 20 years of exile, Jacob is heading home, and we have seen the last of Laban and these tensions that he has had with them. So what has Jacob learned in 20 years of exile? Well, he has certainly learned to be patient in circumstances. He has had to work 14 years for the wives that he married. He has worked 6 more years that the Lord has used to accumulate the provision that he has, his wealth, but all the while working with a guy who was constantly trying to undermine him. He's learned certainly patience. He's learned to deepen his trust in the God of his grandfather Abraham, in the God of his father Isaac, but also in the God who first appeared to him at Bethel when he was on his way to Haran to be with Laban before he ever entered into this 20 years that he's just now coming out of. And now he is returning home, but the future is still very uncertain. There's a lot of things that are unknown that he's getting ready to head into with his own family as he returns after being gone for 20 years. He's still going to have this encounter with Esau. That's the reason he left in the first place. And he has no idea how that's going to work out. He doesn't have any idea how things are going on at home with his parents and all of his family. But he's trusting God with all those things. And it just reminds me that the same is true with us. We We often find ourselves in places that are uncertain. We don't certainly know the future, but God has revealed himself in ways to us. He's given us experiences. And what he's always asking of us is to trust him with the next steps, whatever's coming now. I tell you, right now we're in this time of great uncertainty, and we're literally taking it one week at a time, one day at a time. But it's a good reminder that we have to trust the Lord with all of these things. We need to look back and see where God has always been faithful in the past and trust him with the uncertainties of the future. It's a good lesson that we learn here in chapter 31. So continue to read on. Soon you'll be seeing a video in chapters 32 and 33. We'll get those out this week before the week is over. And just continue to grow in the Word and continue to read through this marvelous book of Genesis as we learn this together. We'll see you next time.